Hey everyone, I'm going to read 2 stories today from a book that a lot of our friends love with 2 characters we also love. I know that this is one of Wilder's favorites that we have at school. I read 2 stories with Frog and Toad. And the first story we're going to read is named after the season that we're in right now. Does anyone remember what season that is? It's not winter, spring. Right, we're in spring now. Okay, so let's find out what Toad and Frog get up to in this story. Frog ran up the path to Toad's house. He knocked on the front door. Knock, knock, knock. There was no answer. Toad, Toad, shouted Frog. Wake up, it's spring. Blah, said a voice from inside the house. Toad, Toad, cried Frog. The sun is shining. The snow is melting. Wake up. I'm not here, said the voice. Frog walked into the house. It was dark. All the shutters were closed. Toad, where are you? Called Frog. Go away, said the voice. From a corner of the room, Toad was lying in bed. He had pulled the covers over his head. Sometimes we probably feel like that. We just want to stay in our cozy beds in the morning. Frog pushed Toad out of bed. He pushed him out of the house and onto the front porch. Toad blinked in the bright sun. Help, said Toad. I cannot see a thing. Don't be silly, said Frog. What you see is the clear, warm light of April. And today is actually the first day of April, too, for us. And it means that we can begin a whole new year together, Toad. Think of it, said Frog. We'll skip through the meadows and run through the woods and swim in the river. In the evenings, we will sit right here on this front porch and count the stars. You can count them, Frog, said Toad. I will be too tired. I'm going back to bed. Toad went back into the house. He got into the bed and pulled the covers over his head again. But Toad, cried Frog, you will miss all the fun. Listen, Frog, said Toad. How long have I been asleep? You have been asleep since November, said Frog. Sounds like Toad was hibernating. Well then, said Toad, a little more sleep will not hurt me. Come back again and wake me up at about 1/2 May. Good night, Frog. But Toad, said Frog, I will be lonely until then. Toad did not answer. He had fallen asleep. Frog looked at Toad's calendar. The November page was still on top. Frog tore off the November page. He tore off the December page, and the January page, the February page, and the March page. He came to the April page. Frog tore off the April page too. Then Frog ran back to Toad's bed. Toad, Toad, wake up! It's May now. What? Said Toad. Can it be May so soon? Yes, said Frog. Look at your calendar. Toad looked at the calendar. The May page was on top. Why, it is May, said Toad as he climbed out of bed. Then he and Frog ran outside to see how the world was looking in the spring. Okay, friends, the next story we're going to read is called The Story. Okay, let's see what happens in this story with Frog and Toad. One day in summer, Frog was not feeling well. So it's not spring anymore in this story. It's now summer, the next season. Toad said, Frog, you're looking quite green. But I always look green, said Frog. I'm a frog. Today you look very green. Even for a frog, said Toad. Get into my bed and rest. Toad made Frog a cup of hot tea. Frog drank the tea, and then he said, tell me a story while I am resting. All right, said Toad. Let me think of a story to tell you. Toad thought and thought, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. I will go out to the front porch and walk up and down, said Toad. Perhaps that will help me to think of a story. Toad walked up and down on the porch for a very long time, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. Then Toad went into the house, and he stood on his head. Why are you standing on your head? Asked Frog. I hope that if I stand on my head, it will help me think of a story, said Toad. Toad stood on his head for a very long time. Silly Toad. But he could not think of a story to tell Frog. Then Toad poured a glass of water over his head. Do you think that's going to help him think of a story to tell? I'm not so sure either. Why are you pouring water over your head? Said Frog. I hope that if I pour water over my head, it will help me to think of a story, said Toad. Toad poured many glasses of water over his head, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. Then Toad began to bang his head against the wall. Why are you banging your head against the wall? Asked Frog. I hope that if I bang my head against the wall, it will help me to think of a story, said Toad. Don't think that's a very good idea. He's not being very gentle with his body. I am feeling much better now, Toad, said Frog. I do not think I need a story anymore. Then you get out of bed and let me get into it, said Toad, because now I feel terrible. Frog said, Would you like me to tell you a story, Toad? Yes, said Toad, if you know one. Once upon a time, said Frog, there were two good friends, a frog and a toad. The frog was not feeling well. He asked his friend the toad to tell him a story. The toad could not think of a story. He walked up and down on the porch, but he could not think of a story. He stood on his head, but he could not think of a story. He poured water over his head, but he could not think of a story. He banged his head against the wall, but he still could not think of a story. Then the toad did not feel so well, and the frog was feeling better. So the toad went to bed, and the frog got up to tell him a story. The end. How was that, Toad? Said Frog. But Toad did not answer. He had fallen fast asleep. So in that story, it really showed kindness between Frog and Toad. They helped each other when they both weren't feeling well, which is a very kind and important thing to do, and something we can do with our friends and our families as well. Thanks for reading with me, friends.